Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm a somatic teacher and therapist. Welcome to this second video out of the series where I show you how you can use some really simple principles to find more ease in movement and in your body in general. So today we'll look at yielding. Yielding means surrendering or finding the support of the earth, of the ground underneath you. And the truth is that we tend to develop over the lifetime lots of guarding and holding patterns, which are not really necessary. So sometimes you might be technically in contact with the ground, but you're not really receiving its support. You are doing like extra effort, as if you're not really wanting to get that support that you have underneath you, or you might have the opposite tendency, which would be kind of collapsing entirely without using your natural tensegrity structure. So let's have a look at how that yielding could look like in various relations to gravity and depending on how many parts of your body are in contact with the ground. So let's say when you go down to the ground and you land with most of your body in contact with the ground. That is where you might start noticing that you still have that kind of holding and guarding patterns. And it usually takes quite a while and a little bit of time, negotiations, a couple of deeper breaths for you to start noticing that it was actually happening. So if you keep on sending that message that all weight of your feet can rest onto the mat, onto the ground, the entire weight of your pelvis could do that as well. The entire weight of your rib cage, the shoulder blades and entire shoulder girdle. And then the weight of your arms and head. You might notice that just after a few breaths spent here, you might start feeling that yielding a little bit more. It could be enough, but it's not always the case. So sometimes what you need is a little bit of a contrast. So you might do something like pushing with your feet away from the mat, just a tiny bit, not enough to lift anything, just a little bit of more pressure, more of that pressure placed on the feet so that you really feel that a lot of weight is there. And then you can release it. And then do the opposite movement, which would be as if you wanted to lift your feet off the mat, but somehow your legs are so heavy that it's impossible. So your feet are kind of almost hovering on the mat, they barely touch it. And then you rest somewhere in the middle, and that would be the yield. Okay, so it's that middle ground. And you could repeat that with literally with every part of the body, pressing a little bit more in with an effort and then releasing it. And then trying to avoid resting any weight of that particular part of the body on the ground, but without lifting it. And that's how you might find that yield. It's particularly interesting with the head. You might imagine head is that super heavy thing. I made an entire video on that. And then you can let it go, or even slightly press with the skull into the mat, and then release it. So after doing that with separate parts of the body, or maybe some sections all at once, after a while, you might start noticing that that relationship to the ground changed, that your body is resting a little bit more and more evenly over various parts of the body that are in contact with the ground. So that would be the example of a yield when you are lying down. But now let's see how it changes when your lymph starts to float. So I really like this one. Some people call it puppeteer, as your limbs are kind of really floaty and relaxed here. And you might imagine that there are some strings attached to your toes and to the fingertips, or maybe to your ankles and to your wrists. And somebody is kind of capable of pulling by the strings, which creates a little bit more lengthening, but then it lets go of that. And the moment that invisible person pulling by the strings lets go of that effort, that is when all the weight of your limbs sink deep into the joints. So you're yielding the weight of your legs deep into the hip joints. And you know it's happening when you have that kind of floaty feeling, as if your limbs were floating somewhere in the water, like some seaweed. So you don't really feel the weight of them. And if they will be at a different angle, or if you're gonna create a lot of muscular engagement, it's gonna get really tiring pretty quickly. But once you trust more the construction of your bones, and you're in that relationship with the gravity, you can let the weight of the bones sink deeply into the shoulder joints and hip joints. And there's still enough of that tensegrity, that minimum effort required, so that your limbs don't collapse entirely, right? But it's really, you don't really need much for this to happen. And you could stay here floating with your belly soft, with your facial muscles soft for quite a while. You might sometimes play with that little bit of a reach, which comes it's like almost external force doing it for you, as if somebody was doing that reach for you, and then returning deep into the joints, which creates this kind of subtle pulsation. So that's the difference with trying to keep the limbs up. So now I'm doing it in a non-yielding way. Let's say somebody told me that I have to lift my limbs, and I'm holding them. So there is my thigh muscles will soon start to shake from the effort. My arm muscles are tense. I can feel my belly hardening. And I have to hold all these limbs up. And this is work. This is work. This is like very engaged way, over engaged way of doing it. Okay. So you can play a little bit with that, and perhaps all four limbs at once is a little bit too much, and you can first play with the arms. They tend to be easier, and after a while Check also how it goes with the legs. Maybe do one leg at a time first, and eventually go for all four limbs. So that's how the yield would look like lying on the back. But then let's see how would it look like in a more uh, dynamic sequences, or somewhere where you have less support from the earth. So let's say if you choose all fours, that's when that contact with the ground is limited now to both palms and lower legs, from the knees all the way to the toes. So here it's nice to play between the total collapse. So yielding, it doesn't mean collapsing. Collapsing would mean that you're letting go of any effort whatsoever, and like any kind of holding. It's when you're loading your joints with all the weight. So in this case, it would mean that your palms kind of almost don't touch the ground at all, because all the weight is in the wrists. That's what happens a lot with the people who first start doing, let's say, yoga. They'll complain that, oh, they have their wrists are very weak, or they have inflexible wrists. I tend to say lots of things, but what really happens is that they simply collapse all their weight into their wrists. And the same could happen with the knees here. So you might be kind of almost not touching even the ground with the rest of the lower legs, as all that weight is sinking deeply into the knees. And that collapse happens also in the lower back and in the space between the shoulder blades. It's quite painful. So that is maybe not so much tiring as more painful, yeah. And you could also do the opposite. So let's say you were always trained in this kind of really active sort of forms, uh, yeah, like very dynamic styles of yoga, or any sort of like workout, and then you would always told to be very engaged. So you would be pushing away with the ground with all your fingers, and pressing down with the front of the feet, maybe pushing away with that space between the shoulder blades a little bit, and definitely engaging and tensing up the muscles in the belly, maybe also in the pelvic floor, maybe even in the buttocks. So everything would be super tense. And again, when you are like this, you can barely breathe, just because all the muscles are so tense, there is no space for that breath. And there's a lot of effort. So even though you don't really do anything here, it's quite a passive pose, right? You might get tired of it pretty soon if there's all of that engagement there. So how the yield would look like? The yield is the space in between of these two. So when you place the hands somewhere in front of you, and I would really recommend you to decide for yourself where the fingers point, and what angle exactly the palms will be at. That's why you want to feel that weight is distributed evenly over whole palms, so there is no sinking into the wrists. And the support of the arms is there, so there's no sinking in that space between the shoulder blades. You might move it, finding the middle ground there as well. You imagine that there's that whole space that supports you, so it's not just the knees, but the whole lower legs. And there's still space for a bit of softening in a belly. It doesn't mean that when you soften the belly, your lower back goes plonking down. Yeah. So it can be soft and you can still maintain that um, shape that prevents you from collapsing and hanging in the joints. So this is the yield. And you could try it in various forms. You could, for example, shift the weight a tiny bit forward, trying to keep the same sort of lightness. Even if there's a little bit more weight, you could still yield without collapse as you shift the weight a tiny bit more towards the palms. And if you want to move it into something more dynamic, it might be the yielding of the legs, yielding the weight of the legs that eventually help you transfer the weight forward to all fours. So as you give more weight for the legs, that allows you to move forward to all fours. And you could use this principle for any other position. Let's say if you want to move towards the down dog, there's that feeling that you really have to put a lot of effort to not give your weight to the ground. Almost the entire body has to tense up. And when you sink, everything becomes really heavy and painful. And then there is that middle ground of giving the weight, resting for the structure from the palms, through the hands, all your bones without locking them, always some little space in the joints. And what could get you out there towards the down dog would be keeping these arms as they are. They don't really need to push away. The only thing would be kind of opening the legs underneath you. So maybe giving some more weight through the feet to end up in a shape that it's not your beautiful kind of down that you might know from yoga, but it might be much more restful. So you don't really worry about the knees, but you have kind of even weight through all limbs, and you can always check it lifting one palm and the other, keeping it all soft. And that's how we might move towards the forward fold. And here again, the situation changes as for a moment you can still have the support with all four limbs. If the fingers don't really reach to the ground, they might be resting also on the forearms, might be resting on the thighs, so you might rest the hands somewhere on the front of the feet, or maybe they might be resting somewhere on the shins. They kind of choose where they want to land, but you still have that extra support. And you might want to shift the weight a couple of times between your toes and heels to find the space when you really rest through the feet. And again, what might move you upwards here is that yield through the feet. So you kind of give the weight down through the feet, and that gives you the uplift. It's like this interplay between the gravity and it's that other force, the opposite force of levity, of kind of uplift. So you give the weight through the feet, and then it's almost as if you were going up the elevator, and you feel that force traveling through your lower legs and through the upper legs, reaching to your pelvis, and then it continues traveling up through the belly and the back, uh, and the chest, upper back. And somewhere at the end is the head. So once you're up there, you can feel how is it to stand on 2 feet. And it's an entire art of its own to let your body weight yield through the feet. So it might be pushing away, it might be again this kind of engaged feeling that you might be also learning from some forms of sports or some styles of yoga when you will kind of push away and tense up everything. And check if you can instead find much more softness in it. So allowing the structure of the bones to hold you there. So you can find a place where your feet can land, where they really want to land, where it feels most natural for you. You can play with it a little bit. You might shift the weight a few times between one foot and the other so that you find a space somewhere in the middle. Find some softness at the back of the knees, almost as the knees were smiling. So just a little bit of softness there. And you yield through the feet, through the whole soles of the feet. You might imagine that everything below your waistline becomes very heavy and it's sinking down to the earth. All the weight of your legs sinks down. That means that there can be some softness in the pelvic floor, in the belly. All of that is yielding down through both feet. And it feels so heavy that you might even make a hole in the floor. So if you were in the sand, you would sink deep into the sand. But then there is also that counter force. So as the lower portion of the body yields in that place where it makes it very sustainable, the upper portion of the body finds some space. Almost as if something was very gently tugging you by the top of the head up towards the ceiling with every inhalation. So upper portion of the body becomes light and spacious, while the lower is super stable as it yields down. And that helps you with finding balance. So if you shift that weight and yield through one leg, keeping it still elastic, so never tensing it up or locking it, that frees up that other foot. You could test it a couple of times. First, just shifting the weight and lifting that one foot, noticing that the other leg is enough, that yielding through one foot is enough. And once you find it really resting and supporting, you could start playing with that other leg and do anything you want with it, drawing some circles, lifting it, moving it in space, while that other leg still yields and supports you. You could even make a little dance, moving your body all the way, maybe even reaching to the ground and coming back, while that yielding leg is still your support. And then it's the same, shifting the weight to the other foot. And you might notice the other one shakes more, it's weaker. Maybe it's because it always does a little bit less work. As one foot yields, the other one becomes free. And then both can yield again. And it's the same for upper portion of the body. So if you waited for that, you could wait until there's that connection from the collarbone moving all the way to your hand. So if you wait for the breath to aid you with that, wait for that uplift, you can let your arms float quite effortlessly and then let them yield the weight of the arms deep into the shoulder joints so that the arms can stay without much effort. And then allow them to float down also without effort. So that's how the yield can be helpful in various sorts of movements and relations to the gravity. I hope that you enjoyed that little play, and I really encourage you with trying the yielding in the various positions that go way beyond what I showed you today. I'll continue with this series next week. So if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe. And I also encourage you to sign up for my weekly newsletter with kindness, where I share a little bit more about how these sort of practices could help you manage chronic stress, anxiety, chronic pain, and more. Thank you very much.